In this video, we will demonstrate the ReSTNSX multi-tenancy feature for VMware NSX. We'll start by logging in as the administrator and clicking into the tenant management dashboard. On this dashboard, you'll see the option to create a new tenant. You'll also see some tenant metrics for all the tenants on the system and some query options to query objects specific to those tenants. We'll go ahead and start by clicking Create a Tenant. Our first tenant we'll name Tenant 1. We have the ability to add a description, organization, and department. You can also select which NSX Manager, transport zone, and data center that the tenant will be bound to. If we had another tenant, we could copy settings from that tenant to this tenant. In this case, we're just going to enter some login banner information and basic support and contact information for the tenant space. On this screen, we'll set up a tenant administrator user account along with its password. Note that the tenant user will be at tenant 1. In this case, we're creating a user admin at tenant 1. We'll go ahead and specify a password, and then we can move on to specifying what permissions we want to grant to this tenant. Through ReSTNSX, you can restrict the tenant user's ability to access certain features such as managing distributed firewall rules, creating edge services gateways, or creating logical switches. In this case, we will unselect the option for the tenant to be able to manage logical switches. We'll click the next button to create the tenant, and this will drop us into the tenant's dashboard. Since we're logged in as administrator, we see all of the configuration tasks even though the tenant will not have access to switching. You'll note that the banner that we set up on the second screen of the Create Tenant wizard pops up as soon as we get into the tenant dashboard. We'll click OK to get rid of that. This tenant dashboard is customized specifically to the tenant. You'll note that the metrics at the top only reflect metrics for that given tenant. If we click on the support icon, the support information we entered when creating the tenant shows. We will log out and log back in as the tenant with the user we created, admin at tenant 1. When we log in, note again that we get the banner. but we do not have all of the configuration tasks that the administrator user has. When we're logged in as the tenant, we're only allowed to see what the administrator has allowed us to see. We cannot get to the other parts of the ReSTNSX application. A user logged in as a tenant only has visibility into their own objects. When you click on the query window and select a query to run, the tenant can only see their own objects. We'll go ahead and log back out and log in as the administrator and create another tenant. When we go into the tenant management dashboard, you'll notice that we have our existing tenant along with some metrics. We'll go ahead and click create and create a second tenant. This tenant will be named tenant 2. We're going to copy the settings from tenant 1, and you'll note that all of the same support information and login banner came over. We'll create a user for this tenant. It will be admin at tenant 2. We'll enter a password. And for this tenant, we will change the tenant permissions to allow the tenant to have access to everything. We click create, we're dropped back into the tenant specific dashboard. So we'll go ahead and log out as administrator and log in as the admin at tenant 2. And this will give us access to the tenant 2's dashboard. We'll create a logical switch by clicking on switching to see the tenant's logical switches, and then click add to add a switch. In this screen, we're creating a logical switch called MyLS. You'll see the job status finished as it's been created. We refresh our list and you see MyLS is listed as a logical switch. We'll drop back to the tenant dashboard. You can see in the query window that MyLS shows up as a logical switch for this tenant. You can also notice that the dashboard metric reflects one logical switch. Now we'll log into vCenter and take a look at the tenant objects created through ReSTNSX. You'll notice that we had a virtual machine named tenant 1 and virtual machine named tenant 2 previously. We'll go select networking and security and firewall and notice that we have created a L3 section for each one of the tenants. This happens automatically when a tenant is created. We click on logical switches, you'll see the MyLS logical switch that we created for tenant 2. Note that the name in vCenter includes the tenant name The tenant objects, though they're prefixed with the tenant name, are masked within the tenant space so the tenant does not see the prefix for each one of their objects. Now we'll switch back to ReSTNSX and look at the tenant dashboard for the tenant administrator. Note that we have two tenants now. We can query virtual machines for both tenants from the admin console. We can click into each one of the tenants. We can change the tenant settings. If we needed to delete the tenant, we can click delete. This screen shows us all the objects that would be deleted with this tenant. We'll go ahead and click delete and confirm that. And we'll go ahead and delete tenant 2 as well. Note that this tenant has a logical switch in addition to its L3 section and distributed firewall rule. We'll go ahead and finish deleting that tenant as well. And we'll switch back into vCenter and note how the objects that we created through ReSTNSX have now been cleaned up. The logical switch has been deleted, and if we click back onto the firewall rules, we'll see that the two L3 sections that we had previously noted for tenant 1 and tenant 2 have been deleted. And that concludes our demonstration on multi-tenancy in VMware NSX using ReSTNSX. Thank you for watching, and please visit our website at www.restnsx.com and follow us on Twitter at ReSTNSX.